Stephanie Ramirez thought accepting a lady's companion position was the safest decision she'd ever made. She was wrong, dead wrong. And by the time she realized it, there was nowhere left to run. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The January fog clung to Valenmore Hall like a secret, transforming the Yorkshire estate into something between fortress and phantom. Inside the west drawing room, the winter gathering hummed with restrained elegance, crystal catching firelight, the low murmur of titled voices, the faint perfume of hothouse roses arranged in silver vases. Stephanie Ramirez stood near the tall windows overlooking the frost-blackened gardens, her borrowed burgundy gown perfectly appropriate, yet somehow marking her as other, desperately wishing she could fade into the damask wallpaper. "Miss Ramirez," came the measured voice she'd been avoiding all evening. "Surely you won't retire before the Duchess has finished her tour of the new gallery. She specifically mentioned wanting your impressions." Mrs. Wycliffe, the household steward, moved closer with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to herding reluctant guests. At 57, with silver-threaded hair pulled into a severe knot and eyes that catalogued everything, she had decided that Stephanie, 21, underemployed and dangerously grateful, required guidance. "Mrs. Wycliffe, I'm afraid I've developed the most dreadful headache," Stephanie replied, edging toward the corridor that led to the guest wing. "The travel, you understand. Perhaps I should—" "Then allow me to escort you to the library. The Duchess keeps lavender sachets there, most restorative." "That won't be necessary." But Mrs. Wycliffe's gloved hand was already gesturing toward the inner hallway. Stephanie made a split-second decision. She murmured an apology and slipped through the nearest doorway, not toward her assigned room, but down the servants' corridor she'd noticed that morning, her heart hammered against her stays. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Wycliffe's controlled but pointed sigh and the rustle of skirts following. Mortification burned her cheeks, but not as much as the thought of being managed for one more carefully orchestrated moment. The corridor narrowed, lit only by intermittent sconces casting amber shadows against oak paneling. Stephanie's soft-soled slippers made no sound on the polished floor. A door stood slightly ajar ahead, warm light spilling through the gap. Voices drifted from within, low, deliberate, private. "Miss Ramirez, please." Mrs. Wycliffe's voice echoed behind her, closer now. "The Duchess will think you unwell." Panic fluttered in Stephanie's throat. Without thinking, she pressed herself against the wall beside the half-open door, holding her breath, praying the shadows would hide her until the steward passed. The voices inside continued, unaware. "Examined her references thoroughly, Your Grace. No significant connections, no political entanglements. The family name carries just enough weight to be respectable, but not enough to be protected." Stephanie's pulse stuttered. That was the Duchess's voice. Cool, analytical, the voice of a woman who had never needed to raise it. "And her temperament?" Duchess Melissa Vasquez asked. "Observant, compliant, intelligent enough to learn quickly, but not so clever as to question instructions. She arrived precisely when summoned and has made no inquiries about departure." Silence followed. Not empty, deliberate. Then quietly, as though approving the selection of wallpaper or a new horse, "She will do." The words landed like a physical blow. Stephanie's breath caught. Her fingers pressed against the cold wall to steady herself. The floor seemed to tilt. "She will do." Not a question, not a consideration. A verdict. Behind her, Mrs. Wycliffe's footsteps had stopped. Stephanie realized with sudden, horrible clarity that the steward had not been chasing her at all. She had been herding her. Toward this exact hallway, at this exact moment. Stephanie's vision blurred at the edges. Every kind word, every polite question, every carefully arranged moment since her arrival, recontextualized in an instant. She had not been invited to Valenmore Hall. She had been selected. The Duchess's voice continued inside the room, calm and businesslike, discussing timelines and arrangements Stephanie could not yet hear clearly. Her legs felt unsteady. She needed to move. Back down the corridor, toward her room, anywhere. But her body refused to cooperate. From the drawing-room doorway, the faint clink of crystal, laughter, the safe, glittering world she'd just fled. A world that now felt impossibly far away. Miss Ramirez. Stephanie's head snapped up. Mrs. Wycliffe stood at the corridor's entrance, silhouetted by the light from the drawing-room. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture suggested she had been waiting. "The Duchess," Mrs. Wycliffe said quietly, "will see you now." Not a question, not a request. Stephanie's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her skirt to still them, lifted her chin with a composure she did not feel, and stepped away from the wall. The door to the drawing-room opened fully. Duchess Melissa Vasquez sat near the fire, elegant and unruffled, a ledger open on the table beside her. She looked up as Stephanie entered, her expression pleasant, even warm. "Ah, Miss Ramirez. Mrs. Wycliffe mentioned you were feeling unwell. Please sit. We should talk about your future here at Valenmore." Stephanie crossed the threshold. The door closed softly behind her, and in that instant she understood there had never been a choice. Only the illusion of one. To understand how thoroughly she had been trapped, one must first understand what brought Stephanie Ramirez to Valenmore Hall in the first place, and why she had been so desperately grateful for the invitation. The days at Valenmore Hall unfolded with the precision of a clockwork music box, beautiful, intricate, and utterly inescapable. Stephanie's mornings began with tea served at precisely 8 o'clock, the cup already waiting on her bedside table, though she never heard anyone enter. Breakfast in the small dining room followed. Soft-boiled eggs, toast triangles arranged in perfect geometry, the Duchess presiding from the head of the table with a newspaper she never quite finished reading. "Your family's estate was in Derbyshire, I believe?" Melissa asked one morning, her tone conversational, her eyes sharp over the rim of her teacup. "My grandfather's estate, Your Grace. It was sold before I was born." "Ah, and your mother's people?" "Modest, respectable." Stephanie kept her voice neutral. "No significant holdings." The Duchess nodded, satisfied, and returned to her newspaper. But Stephanie noticed Mrs. Wycliffe making a small notation in the ledger beside her plate. Everything was recorded. Everything was assessed. The household staff moved around Stephanie with choreographed deference. Doors opened before she reached them. Her cloak appeared on hooks she hadn't approached. When she attempted to post a letter to a former employer inquiring about spring positions, she found it the next morning carefully placed back on her writing desk, unstamped, unopened, but unmistakably redirected. No one explained. No one apologized. At dinner, the Duchess's questions grew more pointed. "You strike me as adaptable, Miss Ramirez, the sort of woman who understands that security often requires flexibility." "I've always tried to be practical, Your Grace." "Practical?" Melissa smiled, a small, approving curve of lips. "And willing to sacrifice personal comfort for long-term advantage?" Stephanie's fingers tightened around her fork. "When circumstances require it." "Excellent." That night, Stephanie stood in the corridor outside her room, listening to the house settle. Floorboards creaked. Somewhere below, voices murmured. Too low to distinguish words, but unmistakably purposeful. She descended halfway down the servants' stair, staying in shadow. Exactly what her Grace wanted. No family to make inquiries. By spring it will be her name. They had said her name. Stephanie pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breath shallow. The voices faded toward the kitchen. She returned to her room and stood at the window, staring out at the frost-silvered gardens. Valenmore Hall no longer felt like refuge. It felt like a trap lined with velvet, and she had walked into it willingly, gratefully, with her eyes wide open. The worst part wasn't that she'd been chosen. It was that she still didn't know what for. The evening had been unremarkable until Stephanie found herself alone in the East Corridor, returning a book to the library the Duchess had lent her that morning. The gesture had seemed generous at the time. Now, nothing seemed simple. Light spilled from beneath the drawing-room door ahead, warm, golden, inviting. Voices drifted through the gap, low and unhurried. Stephanie slowed, instinct warning her to retreat, but curiosity, and something darker, something like dread, rooted her in place. She recognized the Duchess's voice immediately. Her references are impeccable, if modest. No entanglements, no scandals. The cousin who arranged her placement has already sailed for India and won't return for 3 years. Mrs. Wycliffe's response was barely audible. And her disposition, Your Grace. Observant without being intrusive. Obedient without being servile. Intelligent enough to learn what's required, but not so clever as to question why. Pause. The soft clink of crystal. She's also desperate enough to be grateful. That matters most. Stephanie's fingers tightened around the book's leather binding. The timing, then? Mrs. Wycliffe asked. Spring, before the season begins in London. We'll need her prepared by then. Wardrobe, comportment, the necessary understandings. Another pause. Longer. Waited. Then, with the calm finality of a judge delivering sentence, she will do. The cold hit Stephanie first, a wave of it that started in her chest and radiated outward until her fingers went numb. The corridor tilted. She pressed her free hand against the wall, the papered surface suddenly too close, the air too thin. She will do. Not a question, not a consideration, a conclusion. Every kindness replayed in her mind with sickening clarity, the invitation presented as opportunity, the Duchess's gentle questions, the extended stay framed as hospitality. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been kind. She had been evaluated like livestock at a market, and she had passed inspection. Stephanie's breath came in short, silent gasps. She backed away from the door, her slippers soundless on the runner, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it through the walls. She reached the library and closed herself inside, leaning against the door with trembling hands. The book slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a muffled thud. She had not been invited to Valenmore Hall. She had been chosen, and she understood now with terrible clarity that she had never been free to leave. Stephanie woke the next morning with a single, crystalline thought. I must leave. She dressed quickly, her hands steadier than they'd been the night before. Fear had calcified into something sharper, resolve. She would request a carriage, cite a family emergency, anything plausible, anything immediate. But when she descended for breakfast, the Duchess was absent. Her Grace has taken the early carriage to the village, Mrs. Wycliffe explained, pouring tea with mechanical precision. A matter of estate business. She won't return until late afternoon. I see. Stephanie kept her voice light. Perhaps I might send word to the stables myself. I've had news from home that requires... The grooms are occupied with the horses today. Veterinary inspection, you understand. Most inconvenient timing. Mrs. Wycliffe's smile was pleasant, impenetrable. Perhaps tomorrow would be more suitable for travel arrangements. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. Stephanie retreated to her room and pulled out writing paper. 3 letters drafted in careful script. One to her distant cousin in London, one to a former employer, one to a school friend she hadn't contacted in months. Each described urgent personal matters requiring her immediate departure. She sealed them, addressed them, left them on the entrance hall table for posting. By evening they had vanished. "Were my letters collected for the post?" she asked a passing housemaid. The girl blinked, confused. "Letters, miss. I didn't see any letters." That night at dinner, the Duchess finally appeared, serene and apologetic. "Mrs. Wycliffe mentioned you wished to speak with me, Miss Ramirez. I do hope nothing is amiss." Stephanie met her gaze across the candlelit table. "I've been thinking it might be time for me to seek new placement, Your Grace. I wouldn't want to overstay." "Overstay?" Melissa's laugh was warm, almost maternal. "My dear, you've barely arrived. Besides, leaving abruptly after such a brief tenure would raise questions. Future employers do talk, you know. They wonder about instability, unreliability." She dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Better to complete at least one full season, wouldn't you agree? Establish a proper reference." The words landed softly, lethally. Stephanie's throat tightened. To leave now would mark her as flighty, ungrateful, unemployable. The Duchess had never raised her voice, never locked a door. She had simply closed every future that didn't run through Valenmore Hall. Stephanie set down her fork with trembling fingers. Valenmore didn't imprison bodies. It imprisoned options, and she had none left. The gowns appeared on a Tuesday morning. Stephanie opened her wardrobe to find 3 new dresses hanging where her modest traveling clothes had been: silk in deep sapphire, velvet in midnight blue, taffeta in champagne gold. Each cut expertly, each far too fine for a lady's companion. "Compliments of her grace," the housemaid murmured when Stephanie inquired. She felt your current wardrobe was insufficient for Valenmore's gatherings. Gatherings Stephanie hadn't been told about, hadn't been invited to, yet. The etiquette lessons intensified that same week. Mrs. Wycliffe began appearing at breakfast with corrective observations delivered in honeyed tones. "A lady never contradicts directly, Miss Ramirez. She suggests alternatives. Your posture is admirable, but perhaps soften the shoulders. Strength should never appear aggressive. When addressing gentlemen of rank, defer to their expertise, even when you know better. Especially when you know better." At dinner, the Duchess engaged Stephanie in discussions that felt less like conversation and more like examination. "What are your thoughts on the reform bill, Miss Ramirez?" "I confess I haven't followed it closely, Your Grace." "Wise." Melissa smiled approval. "Political opinions in women are so often misunderstood. Better to cultivate receptiveness." When Stephanie dared mention a novel she'd enjoyed, the Duchess's expression cooled fractionally. Popular fiction can be diverting, but a woman of refinement prefers more elevated subjects. Poetry, perhaps. History. A pause. Nothing too contemporary. Stephanie learned quickly. Neutrality earned smiles. Questions earned gentle redirection. Compliance earned praise. "You're adapting beautifully," the Duchess remarked one evening, her hand briefly touching Stephanie's shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a breeder assessing livestock than affection. "I knew you would." In her room that night, Stephanie stood before the mirror in one of the new gowns. The woman staring back looked polished, elegant, malleable. Her opinions had been sanded smooth, her posture adjusted, her words carefully curated. She was being refined. Shaped like clay on a potter's wheel, pressed, molded, trimmed of anything inconvenient. But for what purpose? What role required this specific combination of beauty, obedience, and strategic invisibility? Stephanie's reflection offered no answers. Only the growing, terrible certainty that she was becoming someone useful. And usefulness, she understood now, was the most dangerous thing a powerless woman could be. The summons came on a frost-bright morning in late February. "Her Grace requests your presence in the private study. Immediately, if you please." Stephanie's hands stilled over her embroidery. The word immediately carried weight at Valenmore. It was never used casually. The study was smaller than the drawing room, more intimate. A fire crackled in the grate. Duchess Melissa sat behind a mahogany desk, papers arranged in neat stacks, her expression composed and almost maternal. "Please sit." She gestured to the chair opposite. "We should speak plainly now. You've been patient, and I appreciate discretion." Stephanie sat, her spine rigid despite weeks of posture correction. The Duchess folded her hands, her tone conversational, as though discussing weather. "My son, Adrian, is 26, brilliant, charming, and catastrophically indiscreet. Last autumn, he became entangled with a merchant's daughter, a liaison that produced complications." Stephanie's breath caught. The girl's family is demanding marriage or public scandal. Either outcome would destroy Adrian's prospects and our family's standing. Melissa's gaze never wavered. "What we require is a solution that protects everyone involved. A woman of sufficient birth to be respectable, yet without powerful connections to demand more than we're willing to provide." The room felt airless. "You, Miss Ramirez, are that solution." Stephanie's voice emerged hoarse. "You want me to marry my son. Quietly. A private ceremony this spring, followed by a period of discreet residence here at Valenmore. You'll have security, comfort, position, the protection of our name." The Duchess leaned forward slightly, her expression almost kind. "In exchange, you'll provide legitimacy and discretion regarding certain arrangements. And if I refuse?" Melissa's smile didn't falter. "Refuse? My dear, why would you? You have no prospects, no family to champion you, no employment awaiting. What I'm offering is elevation beyond anything you could achieve independently." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Of course, the choice is entirely yours. I would never presume to force such a decision." But her eyes said otherwise. Stephanie understood with brutal clarity. Refusal would mean ruin. A whispered word in the right circles, instability, ingratitude, unreliability, and every door would close. The Duchess placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "Consider it," she said softly. "There's no hurry." But they both knew there was only one answer. Stephanie spent 3 days with the paper untouched on her writing desk. 3 days weighing rebellion against survival. 3 nights staring at the ceiling, calculating outcomes like a chess player facing checkmate. She could refuse. Walk away with nothing but her dignity and watch every future employment evaporate under whispered rumors. Unreliable, ungrateful, unstable. The words would follow her like shadows. She could accept. Bind herself to a man she'd never met, to a house that had already proven itself a gilded cage, to a life choreographed by a woman who viewed people as instruments. Both choices felt like dying, but one allowed her to keep breathing. On the 4th morning, Stephanie descended to the study with the paper in hand, unsigned. The Duchess looked up from her correspondence, expression expectant but patient. "I accept your Grace's generous offer." Stephanie's voice was steady, emptied of emotion. "On the condition that I may continue my studies. Books, correspondence with educators. I won't be made entirely idle." Melissa's smile bloomed. Genuine pleasure at a bargain successfully closed. "Of course, my dear. Intelligence in a wife reflects well on the family. Within reason, naturally." Within reason. Everything at Valenmore existed within those carefully policed boundaries. Stephanie signed where indicated. The Duchess countersigned with a flourish, then rose and embraced her, a gesture that felt more like a victor claiming spoils than affection. "You've made the wise choice. You'll see." That evening, Stephanie stood at her window watching the Duchess walk the gardens with Mrs. Wickliffe, their heads bent in satisfied consultation. She studied Melissa's gait, her gestures, the way she commanded space without effort. For weeks, Stephanie had been observed, measured, shaped. Now she would observe in return. She would learn the systems that governed Valenmore, the social mechanisms, the financial levers, the relationships that sustained the Duchess's power. She would smile, defer, comply. She would become exactly what they expected: useful, ornamental, contained. But beneath compliance, she would study her captor. And when the moment came, if it came, she would know precisely where to press. Stephanie's reflection stared back from the darkened window, composed and unreadable. She had been chosen, shaped, trapped. But traps, she was learning, had mechanisms, and mechanisms could be understood, then dismantled. Stephanie began her education in earnest the week after signing. She watched, she listened. She asked careful questions disguised as idle curiosity. From the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, she learned that the Duchess's income depended heavily on tenant rents that had been declining for 3 years. Her Grace won't lower them, though. Pride, you understand. But the coffers aren't what they were. From the groundskeeper's daughter, she discovered that Adrian Vasquez hadn't visited Valenmore in 8 months. Stays in London, he does. Gaming debts, they say. His mother sends money regular-like. From the cook, who'd served the family for 30 years, Stephanie heard about the late Duke, a man whose gambling had nearly ruined them before his convenient death in a riding accident. The Duchess rebuilt everything herself, Cook said, kneading dough with practiced hands. Clever woman. Ruthless when needed. But she fears losing it all again. Keeps her awake nights, I'd wager. Fear. The word lodged in Stephanie's mind like a key finding its lock. She began observing the Duchess with new eyes during their daily interactions. Melissa's controlled composure, her obsessive organization, her need to manage every variable. These weren't just personality traits. They were armor against chaos. One afternoon, Stephanie found a ledger left open in the study, whether by accident or test she couldn't determine. She scanned the columns quickly. Debts, investments, correspondence with creditors. The family's position was more precarious than the elegant facade suggested. That evening at dinner, Stephanie mentioned casually that she had once helped her grandfather's steward reconcile accounts. A useful skill, the Duchess remarked, her gaze sharpening with interest. Perhaps you might review our household expenses? A fresh perspective can reveal inefficiencies. It was a small opening. But it was an opening. Over the following weeks, Stephanie made herself indispensable in quiet ways. She identified cost savings, drafted diplomatic correspondence, mediated a dispute between feuding staff members. The Duchess began consulting her, brief questions at first, then longer discussions. Stephanie was no longer invisible. She was becoming necessary. One night, standing again at her window, Stephanie understood something fundamental had shifted. She couldn't flee Valenmore. The cage was still locked, but cages had bars, and bars could be bent by those patient enough to test them. If she couldn't escape, perhaps she could reshape the cage itself. From the inside. The letter arrived on a morning when spring had finally begun thawing Valenmore's frozen grounds. Stephanie was reviewing household accounts in the study when the Duchess entered, holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with crimson wax. Her expression was composed, but something flickered beneath. Satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication. Adrian will arrive next week. Melissa placed the letter on the desk between them. He's agreed to the arrangement. The private ceremony will take place the 1st of April, followed by a small gathering to announce the union to our closest associates. Stephanie's pen stilled. A gathering. Nothing ostentatious. 30 guests, perhaps 40. County families, a few select connections from London. The Duchess's tone remained conversational, but her eyes were calculating. You'll be introduced as a distant relation who's captured my son's affection. A romantic narrative always smooths social complications. And the merchant's daughter? Provided for, quietly relocated. Her family has been persuaded to accept a financial settlement. Melissa smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. All loose ends properly tied. Except Stephanie herself, the newest thread woven into the Duchess's carefully constructed tapestry. That evening, alone in her room, Stephanie stood before the mirror in one of the silk gowns that had appeared months ago. The woman reflected back was no longer the frightened girl who'd overheard 3 damning words through a drawing-room door. She will do. She remembered the cold that had seized her then, the dizziness, the sudden crushing awareness of walls closing in. She'd believed herself trapped, powerless, chosen for purposes beyond her control. She had been right, but being chosen, she understood now, was not an ending. It was a beginning. The Duchess had selected her for malleability, for desperation, for the particular combination of respectability and disposability that made her useful. What Melissa hadn't anticipated was that usefulness could be reciprocal, that the woman she'd shaped might learn to shape in return. Stephanie thought of the ledgers she now managed, the household politics she'd mapped, the quiet alliances she'd cultivated. She thought of the Duchess's fears. Financial instability, social ruin, loss of control, vulnerabilities, all of them. And vulnerabilities could be leveraged by those patient enough to wait. The marriage would proceed. The gathering would take place. Stephanie would smile, defer, play the role assigned to her. But beneath compliance, she would continue watching, learning, positioning. A door had been closed on her, but doors, she had discovered, could be forced open from within. Stephanie turned from the mirror, her expression composed and unreadable. The game had only just begun. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.